The celestial circuit stretched before Aria tossed like a ribbon of impossibility. Its massive expanse wrapped around the entire equator of Kepler 4b, a terraformed exoplanet that served as the neutral ground for the interstellar games. The track itself was a marvel of engineering, with gravity-adjusted lanes that could accommodate beings from high-gravity worlds and delicate creatures from moon-like environments. Environmental chambers dotted the course at regular intervals, ready to provide atmospheric adjustments for the diverse array of competitors. Aria stood at the starting line, her lean frame dwarfed by the towering forms of her alien competitors. At 25 years old, she carried the weight of Earth's athletic reputation on her shoulders, though most in the vast stadium expected her to collapse before the first mile marker. The broadcast commentators, their voices transmitted across dozens of star systems, barely mentioned her name except as a curiosity. The interstellar games had been a tradition for nearly a century, bringing together the greatest athletes from advanced civilizations across the galaxy. Victory here meant more than personal glory. It translated directly into political influence, preferential trade agreements, and cultural prestige. For established powers like the Dracolon Empire or the Veleron Confederacy, success was expected. For Earth, still considered primitive by galactic standards despite achieving faster-than-light travel just 2 decades ago, participation itself was seen as presumptuous. Aria had trained for this moment her entire life, though she hadn't known it until 6 months ago when Earth received its first invitation to the Games. Her daily routine of running 26 miles through Earth's varied terrains, from scorching deserts to oxygen-thin mountain peaks, had prepared her in ways the selection committee couldn't have imagined. While other athletes relied on genetic enhancements and cybernetic augmentations, Aria's strength came from something more fundamental: the human spirit's refusal to acknowledge limits. Dr. Minerva Song, Aria's coach and Earth's leading expert in adaptive athletics, watched from the human delegation's viewing box. The neural feedback system she had designed for Aria was revolutionary by Earth standards, but primitive compared to the biomechanical enhancements sported by other competitors. It merely helped Aria regulate her breathing and monitor her body's signals more efficiently. The real training had been psychological, teaching Aria to embrace discomfort as a companion rather than an enemy. The opening ceremony had been a spectacle of light and sound that defied human comprehension. Holographic displays showed the history of the Games, highlighting past champions and their civilization's subsequent rise to prominence. When Earth's moment came, the presentation was brief and patronizing, focusing on humanity's quaint persistence rather than any expectation of competitive performance. Now, as Aria took her position, she could feel the weight of 1,000,000 alien eyes upon her. To her left stood Zarvix, the Dracolon champion, whose 4 legs could propel him at speeds that would shame Earth's fastest vehicles. His scaled skin shimmered with bioluminescent patterns that indicated supreme confidence. He had looked at Aria during the athlete's briefing with what she could only interpret as amused pity. To her right was Okatar, the Velaran distance specialist whose species had evolved on a world with 30-hour days and endless plains. Their cardiovascular system was a marvel of biological engineering, with 3 hearts working in perfect synchronization. Further down the line stood Thressa, the Phylox sprinter whose muscle fibers could store and release energy like biological springs. The starting signal was a harmonic convergence of tones designed to be equally audible to all species. As it resonated through the stadium, Aria began to run with the measured pace she had perfected over thousands of training runs. The first segment of the course led through a climate-controlled corridor that gradually introduced the competitors to the planet's actual atmosphere. What happened next shocked everyone, including Aria herself. As they emerged into the open air of Kepler 4b, the alien champions began to falter. Zarvix, who had been pulling ahead with magnificent strides, suddenly stumbled. His breathing became labored, and by the time they reached the first mile marker, he had collapsed onto the track, his scales flickering in distress patterns. Okata managed another quarter-mile before their triple cardiovascular system began to misfire, forcing them to stop and gasp for breath. Thressa's spring-like muscles seized up, leaving the Phylox champion writhing in apparent agony. One by one, every alien competitor succumbed to something in the atmosphere that their enhanced physiologies couldn't process. Arya ran on, her breathing steady, her stride unchanged. She passed the mile marker with the same smile she wore during her morning runs back home. The stadium fell silent except for the rhythmic sound of her footfalls on the adaptive track surface. The medical teams that rushed onto the track discovered the cause quickly. Kepler-42b's atmosphere contained trace amounts of a xenon isotope that, while harmless in small doses, interfered with the precise biological enhancements that gave the alien athletes their advantages. It was like a computer virus for biological systems, disrupting the careful balance of their augmented physiologies. Arya's success wasn't due to superior human biology. The analysts would later conclude it was because humans had never relied on such enhancements. Where other species had optimized their bodies for specific conditions, humans had remained generalists, adaptable to a wide range of environments through sheer determination rather than technological intervention. The revelation sent shockwaves through the Interstellar Council. Emergency meetings were called, and heated debates erupted in languages that universal translators struggled to convey. Some delegations demanded Arya's disqualification, arguing that immunity to the atmospheric effect constituted an unfair advantage. Others pointed out that the humans had no knowledge of the isotope's presence and that adaptability itself was a legitimate competitive trait. While the politicians argued, Arya continued to train. Each morning, she would rise before Kepler-42b's binary sunrise and run the same routes through the planet's diverse biomes. The coastal regions with their salt-tinged air reminded her of training along Earth's Pacific coastline. The inland hills, with their thin atmosphere and rocky terrain, brought back memories of Colorado's high-altitude trails. Dr. Song monitored Arya's biometrics obsessively, fine-tuning the neural feedback system to help her maintain optimal performance. But more importantly, she served as a counselor and confidant, helping Arya process the sudden shift from unknown athlete to galactic curiosity. The media attention was overwhelming. Reporters from 100 worlds wanted to understand the human secret. They analyzed Arya's diet, which consisted of simple Earth foods rather than the optimized nutritional supplements favored by other athletes. They studied her training regimen, baffled by its apparent lack of scientific precision. How could someone who trained by simply running every day compete with athletes whose every movement was calculated by advanced AI systems? Arya's standard response became legendary in its simplicity. When asked about her training philosophy, she would smile and say that she ran because she loved running. When pressed about her body's adaptation to the atmospheric conditions, she would shrug and mention that humans had evolved on a world with constantly changing conditions, from ice ages to warming periods, from sea level to mountain peaks. The Draculon delegation was not content to accept defeat. Their scientists worked around the clock to develop countermeasures to the atmospheric interference. They created the Endura Pulse Field, a localized energy emission that would theoretically neutralize the xenon isotope's effects on enhanced physiologies. Zarvix himself underwent painful treatments to build resistance, pushing his body to its limits in hermetically sealed training chambers. The Velaran took a different approach, lobbying the Interstellar Council to ban Arya from competition. Their arguments were sophisticated and multi-layered. Touching on the spirit of fair play and the need for a level playing field, they proposed atmospheric scrubbers that would remove all trace elements from the competition zones, ensuring that no species had an inadvertent advantage. Other delegations pursued their own strategies. The Centaurians developed new breathing apparatus that could filter out harmful isotopes. The Andromedans experimented with genetic modifications that would allow rapid adaptation to changing atmospheric conditions. The competition had evolved from a simple test of athletic ability to a technological arms race. Through it all, Arya continued her daily runs, She found peace in the rhythm of her footfalls, in the steady expansion and contraction of her lungs, in the familiar burn of lactic acid in her muscles. During one particularly challenging run through a series of sand dunes that shifted with the planet's unusual tidal forces, she found herself reflecting on why she ran. It wasn't for glory or political advantage. It wasn't to prove human superiority or to shame other species. She ran because running connected her to something fundamental about being human. It was the same impulse that had driven her ancestors to spread across Earth's continents, to climb its highest peaks and dive to its deepest ocean trenches. It was the simple refusal to accept that any distance was too far, any challenge too great. The midpoint of the training season brought an unexpected challenge. The Interstellar Council, responding to pressure from multiple delegations, announced a surprise qualifying event. All athletes would need to complete a modified course that included segments specifically designed to test adaptability rather than pure physical performance. The course was diabolical in its construction. It began in a frozen tundra where temperatures plunged to levels that would freeze the blood of most species. It then transitioned abruptly to a volcanic region where the air shimmered with heat and toxic gases. The third segment passed through a swamp filled with bioluminescent organisms that released psychoactive spores. The final stretch crossed the shifting sand dunes that Arya had come to know well. The alien athletes, despite their preparations, struggled mightily. The Endura pulse field that the Draculons had developed worked well in controlled conditions but couldn't adapt quickly enough to the rapid environmental changes. Zarvix made it through the frozen section using his species' ability to regulate blood flow, but the volcanic region overwhelmed his systems. Okitar's triple hearts gave them an advantage in maintaining circulation in extreme temperatures. But the psychoactive spores in the swamp segment interfered with their neural processes, causing them to run in circles for nearly an hour before medical teams intervened. Thressa's spring-like muscles, so effective on solid ground, were worse than useless in the shifting sands. The Phylox champions sank with each bound, exhausting their energy reserves before completing half the distance. Arya approached each segment with the same methodical determination she brought to every run. The frozen tundra reminded her of winter training in Alaska, where she had learned to maintain core temperature through constant movement. The volcanic region was similar to Death Valley in summer, where she had trained her body to cool itself efficiently through controlled sweating. The swamp segment was the most challenging. The spores created mild hallucinations, turning the path ahead into a shifting maze of false trails. But Arya had experienced similar disorientation during extreme fatigue in ultramarathons. She focused on her breathing, trusted her muscle memory, and pushed through the confusion. By the time she reached the sand dunes, she was alone on the course. Every other competitor had either dropped out or been removed by medical teams. She crested the final dune to find the finish line surrounded by silent, stunned observers. She crossed it with the same smile she always wore at the end of a good run. The aftermath of the qualifying event was chaotic. Several delegations formally protested, arguing that the course had been designed to favor human physiology. Others countered that adaptability was a legitimate athletic trait and that the course had been equally challenging for all species. The Phylox delegation withdrew from the games entirely, stating that the competition had lost its meaning. The Andromedans threatened to follow suit unless significant changes were made to ensure fairness. The very future of the Interstellar Games hung in the balance. It was Arya who proposed a solution. In a speech before the full Interstellar Council, she suggested that the Games should celebrate diversity rather than trying to create artificial equality. Each species brought unique strengths to competition. Instead of trying to neutralize these differences, why not design events that showcased them? Her proposal was radical but elegant. The marathon would remain, but it would be joined by events suited to different physiologies. Sprint events for species with explosive muscle systems. Endurance events in controlled environments for those with enhanced cardiovascular systems. Precision events for species with superior neural processing. The Games would become a celebration of galactic diversity rather than a single standard competition. The proposal faced resistance, particularly from traditionalists who viewed the marathon as the ultimate test of athletic supremacy. But as discussions continued, more delegations began to see the wisdom in Aria's approach. The Games could evolve to become more inclusive while still maintaining competitive integrity. While the politicians debated, preparations for the final marathon continued. The event would proceed as scheduled, a full 26-mile circuit of the planetary ring. This time, the course would include real environmental hazards: acid rain that fell in certain regions due to atmospheric chemistry, magnetic storms that could interfere with navigation and biological systems, gravitational anomalies where the planet's unusual core composition created pockets of increased or decreased gravity. Aria trained for each hazard methodically. Dr. Song created simulations that exposed her to acidic moisture, teaching her to protect her skin and eyes while maintaining pace. They practiced running through magnetic interference, learning to trust internal navigation when external cues became unreliable. The gravitational anomalies were the most challenging, requiring constant adjustment of stride and breathing to compensate for changing conditions. The alien athletes prepared as well, each according to their species' strengths. Zarvix underwent further modifications to his Endura Pulse system, creating multiple redundancies to prevent total system failure. His training runs grew longer, though he still struggled to pass the 5-mile mark without significant distress. Oktar worked with Veleron physiologists to enhance their already impressive cardiovascular system. They developed a breathing technique that could extract oxygen from even the thinnest atmosphere, though it required intense concentration to maintain. New competitors emerged as well. The Tau Ceti delegation sent Krex Theta, a warrior athlete whose species had evolved on a world of constant volcanic activity. The Virginie system entered Melody of Stars, whose crystalline physiology could theoretically withstand any environmental hazard. As the day of the final marathon approached, Kepler 4b became the focus of galactic attention. Billions of beings across dozens of star systems would watch the event, many still skeptical that a human could compete with the galaxy's best athletes. The night before the race, Aria couldn't sleep. She walked the observation deck of the human quarters, gazing out at the star field that still filled her with wonder. Each point of light represented a world, a civilization, ways of thinking and being that humans were only beginning to understand. Dr. Song found her there, bringing a cup of tea brewed from earth-grown leaves. They sat in comfortable silence for a while before Song spoke. She reminded Aria that regardless of the outcome, she had already achieved something remarkable. She had shown the galaxy that humans belonged among the stars, not as conquerors or supplicants, but as equals with their own unique contributions. The morning of the marathon dawned clear, with both of Kepler 42b's suns casting long shadows across the starting area. The competitors gathered, each in their specialized gear. Zarvix's scales were covered in a reactive coating that would theoretically protect against acid rain. Oktar wore a breathing apparatus that could filter and concentrate oxygen. Krex Theta's natural armor gleamed with heat-resistant oils. Aria wore simple running clothes and shoes, her only concession to technology being the neural feedback device that would help her monitor her body's signals. As she took her position at the starting line, she felt a strange calm descend over her. Everything she had trained for, everything she had learned about herself and her species' capabilities, had led to this moment. The starting signal resonated across the stadium once more. The competitors surged forward, each finding their rhythm as they entered the first section of the course. This time, the atmospheric effects were known and accounted for. The alien athletes had prepared for the xenon isotope, and while it still caused some disruption to their enhanced systems, they pushed through with determination. For the first 3 miles, the pack stayed relatively close together. Krex Theta set a blistering pace, their volcanic-adapted physiology seemingly immune to the early challenges. Melody of Stars moved with an eerie smoothness, their crystalline form refracting the binary sunlight into rainbow patterns. Zarvix had found a sustainable rhythm, his 4 legs carrying him with renewed confidence. Arya settled into her pace, the one she had maintained through thousands of training miles. She focused on her breathing, on the steady rhythm of her heart, on the feeling of the track beneath her feet. The first environmental hazard appeared at mile 4, a pocket of acid rain that fell from clouds formed by the planet's unique atmospheric chemistry. The prepared athletes handled it well initially. Protective coatings and gear deflected the worst of the acidic moisture, but as the exposure continued over the next 2 miles, problems began to emerge. Zarvix's coating started to break down, the acid finding microscopic flaws and exploiting them. He pushed on, but each drop that reached his scales caused visible distress. Melody of Stars discovered that while their crystalline structure was immune to acid, it also refracted and concentrated the droplets, creating focal points of intense chemical reaction. They were forced to slow dramatically, seeking the edges of the rain zone where the effect was less pronounced. Arya had trained for this. She had learned to recognize the early signs of acid rain from the color of the clouds and the smell of the air. She adjusted her posture to minimize exposure, tilted her head to keep droplets from her eyes, and maintained her breathing rhythm despite the burning sensation on her exposed skin. It was unpleasant but manageable, no worse than running through a particularly hostile Earth environment. By mile 7, as they emerged from the acid rain zone, the field had spread considerably. Theta maintained the lead, apparently unaffected by challenges that would have stopped most beings. Behind them, Arya ran in a small group that included 2 new competitors and a surprisingly resilient Okatar, whose breathing apparatus was performing better than expected. The magnetic storm hit at mile 10. It rolled across the landscape like a visible wave, aurora-like effects crackling through the air. For most of the competitors, it was merely disorienting. Their navigation systems went haywire, and those with biomechanical enhancements experienced painful feedback as magnetic fields interfered with their electronics. Zarvix's Endura pulse system, despite all its redundancies, couldn't handle the magnetic interference. It shut down completely, leaving him to run on his natural physiology alone. For a Draculon who had relied on enhancements his entire competitive career, it was like suddenly losing a limb. He stumbled, caught himself, and tried to continue, but his pace dropped dramatically. Arya had no electronics to fail. Only the simple neural feedback device that Dr. Song had hardened against interference. She had trained for this too, learning to run by feel when external navigation became impossible. She fixed her eyes on a distant mountain peak that remained visible through the magnetic distortion and used it as her guide. The gravitational anomalies began at mile 15. Pockets where gravity increased by 30% alternated with areas where it decreased by half. The course markers warned of each change, but knowing and adapting were very different things. Theta, who had maintained the lead so dominantly, hit the first heavy gravity zone at full speed. Their volcanic adapted physiology, built for a high-gravity world, should have handled it easily. But the sudden change caught them off guard. They stumbled, recovered, but had lost crucial momentum. The light gravity zones were equally treacherous. Competitors who pushed off with their normal force found themselves sailing through the air, landing off balance and struggling to maintain direction. Melody of Stars shattered a portion of their crystalline structure in a particularly bad landing, forcing them to withdraw. Arya approached each gravitational shift with the caution born of training. She shortened her stride in heavy zones, maintaining turnover rather than trying to power through. In light zones, she kept her center of gravity low, taking quick, shuffling steps rather than risking the long bounds that seemed tempting. By mile 20, the race had become a war of attrition. Of the dozens who had started, only a handful remained in contention. Theta had recovered from their earlier stumble but was showing signs of fatigue. Their volcanic adaptations, so beneficial in harsh environments, required enormous energy to maintain. Okatar had found a rhythm that worked with their triple cardiovascular system, but the constant environmental changes were taking their toll. Each transition required recalibration, and the cumulative effect was exhausting even their impressive endurance. Zarvix, running now on pure determination without his technological aids, had fallen far behind. But he continued, driven by a pride that transcended physical discomfort. Every step was agony. But he would not give the humans the satisfaction of seeing him quit. Arya ran on, her world narrowed to the essential elements of forward motion. Her muscles burned with accumulated lactic acid. Her lungs fought for every breath in the thin atmosphere of the high-altitude sections. The acid rain had left painful welts on her exposed skin. But beneath it all, deeper than the discomfort, was the rhythm she had found in countless training runs. The meditation of movement that connected her to every human who had ever pushed beyond their limits. Mile 23 brought the final challenge. The course entered a region where all the hazards converged. Acid rain fell through magnetic distortions while gravity shifted unpredictably. It was a zone that the course designers had included almost as an afterthought, assuming that no competitor would still be running strongly enough for it to matter. Krex Theta entered first, their earlier confidence replaced by grim determination. The combination of hazards overwhelmed even their remarkable physiology. They made it perhaps a quarter mile before collapsing, their body finally pushed beyond its limits. Okatar followed, their breathing apparatus struggling to function in the magnetic interference while acid ate at its seals. They managed slightly further before accepting defeat, stopping at the edge of the zone and watching as others attempted what they could not complete. Arya paused at the zone's entrance, taking a moment to assess the challenge. Everything she had trained for led to this moment. She thought of Dr. Song's words about the mental component of endurance. She thought of her childhood coach who had told her that the body could always do more than the mind believed possible. She thought of every human who had ever faced the impossible and decided to try anyway. She entered the convergence zone with the same steady pace she had maintained for 23 miles. The acid rain intensified, finding every gap in her clothing. The magnetic fields made her vision blur and her inner ear rebel. Gravity shifted with each step, turning the simple act of running into a complex calculation. But Arya had learned something over the miles of this race, something that her alien competitors, with all their enhancements, had missed. Pain was just information. Discomfort was just sensation. The body's signals of distress were merely suggestions, not commands. She acknowledged each source of suffering, catalogued it, and set it aside. Her world narrowed to the next step, then the next. Time lost meaning in the chaotic zone. She could have been running for minutes or hours. All that mattered was maintaining forward motion, keeping the rhythm that had carried her this far. She emerged from the convergence zone to find the final straightaway before her. 3 miles of clear track leading to the finish line. Behind her, the zone continued to claim competitors who attempted to follow her path. Some made it partway before turning back. Others collapsed and required medical evacuation. Arya ran on alone, her stride mechanical now, driven by will rather than strength. Each step sent shock waves of pain through her battered body. Her vision tunneled, focusing only on the path ahead. The stadium grew larger with agonizing slowness. With 1 mile to go, her neural feedback device finally succumbed to the accumulated damage. The careful biometric monitoring that had helped her regulate her effort throughout the race went silent. She was left with only her own sensations, the raw data of human endurance. It was then that her childhood mantra returned into her. Pain fades, but pride remains. She had whispered it to herself during brutal training runs in Earth's deserts. She had chanted it while climbing mountains where the air grew thin. It had carried her through every challenge that had brought her to this moment. The final mile was a meditation on suffering. Each step required a conscious decision to continue. Her body screamed for rest, for an end to the torment. But deeper than the physical distress was something that no amount of pain could touch. The pure joy of running. She thought of her ancestors who had persistence hunted across African savannas, running prey to exhaustion under the brutal sun. She thought of the explorers who had crossed continents on foot, driven by curiosity and courage. She thought of every human who had been told they couldn't and had responded by proving they could. The stadium erupted as she entered the final stretch. Beings from 100 worlds rose to witness something they had thought impossible. A human, unenhanced and unaugmented, had not only competed with the galaxy's best, but had surpassed them. Arya didn't hear the cheers. Her world had narrowed to the finish line ahead and the rhythm of her stride. 100 meters, 50, 20, 10. She crossed the finish line with the same smile she wore at the end of every run. It wasn't the grimace of effort or the grin of triumph. It was the simple expression of joy from someone who had found their purpose in motion. The medical teams reached her as her legs finally gave out. They scanned her with devices that catalogued the extent of her body's distress. Dehydration, muscle damage, acid burns, neural exhaustion. By every objective measure, she should have collapsed miles ago. Dr. Song pushed through the crowd to reach her athlete. As the medical teams worked, she held Arya's hand and saw in her eyes not suffering but satisfaction. The readings showed a body pushed to its absolute limits, but the spirit within remained unbroken. The aftermath of Arya's victory sent shockwaves through the interstellar community. The established order of athletic supremacy had been shattered. Civilizations that had invested vast resources in biological and technological enhancements were forced to confront the reality that simple human determination had achieved what their science could not. Tsar Vix, who had finished the race hours after Arya, sought her out in the medical facility. His proud bearing was intact despite his defeat. Through a translator, he expressed something that surprised them both. Respect. He had learned more about the nature of competition in his struggle to finish than in all his previous victories combined. The Interstellar Council convened emergency sessions to discuss the implications. Some delegations argued that the race had been unfair, that the convergence of hazards had created conditions that favored primitive physiologies over advanced ones. Others countered that adaptability itself was a form of advancement, that humans had shown a different path to excellence. Arya, recovering in the medical facility, became the center of a media phenomenon. Requests for interviews poured in from across the galaxy. Scientists wanted to study her physiology. Politicians wanted to use her victory for their own ends. Commercial interests saw marketing opportunities in the human who had beaten the odds. She declined them all. Instead, she spent her recovery time walking the observation decks with Dr. Song, discussing not her victory, but the future of interstellar athletics. Her proposal for diversified events that celebrated each species' strengths gained momentum as more delegations recognized its wisdom. The Phylox, who had withdrawn in anger, returned to the negotiating table. They proposed events that would showcase their unique spring muscle physiology. The Centaurians suggested competitions that emphasized precision and coordination over pure endurance. The Andromedans designed challenges that would test cognitive processing under physical stress. Within weeks, the framework for a new interstellar games emerged. The marathon would remain as one event among many, a test of pure endurance that any species could attempt, but it would be joined by dozens of other competitions, each designed to highlight different aspects of athletic achievement. Arya was invited to join the planning committee, becoming the first human to hold such a position. She accepted on the condition that the games would promote unity rather than division, that victory in any event would be celebrated equally, and that the spirit of competition would never overshadow the joy of participation. The closing ceremony of what became known as the Transformation Games was held 3 months after Arya's historic run. Representatives from every participating civilization gathered in the same stadium where she had collapsed across the finish line. Arya was asked to speak, to share what she had learned from her experience. She stood before the assembled multitudes, still bearing the fading scars from acid burns, and spoke not of human superiority but of universal truths. She talked about the joy of pushing beyond perceived limits, a joy that wasn't unique to humans but was perhaps something they had retained while others had optimized it away. She spoke of failure as a teacher more valuable than any coach, of pain as a companion that revealed true character. Most importantly, she spoke of running not as competition, but as celebration. Every being who lined up at a starting line was already victorious over the voice that said they couldn't. Every step forward was a triumph over entropy, a small rebellion against the universe's tendency toward rest. Her words were translated into dozens of languages, some of which had no equivalent for the concepts she expressed. But the essential message transcended linguistic barriers. Excellence wasn't about being better than others, but about being better than yourself. Victory wasn't about crossing a line first, but about refusing to stop when everything said you should. The legacy of Aria's run extended far beyond athletics. Human traders found new markets as perceptions shifted from seeing Earth as primitive to recognizing it as resilient. Cultural exchanges flourished as other species sought to understand the mental frameworks that enabled humans to endure. Dr. Song published her research on neural feedback training, making it freely available to all species. The techniques, which seemed primitive compared to advanced cybernetics, proved remarkably effective when adapted to different physiologies. The focus on mental conditioning over technological enhancement sparked a renaissance in training methods across the galaxy. Zarvix became an unexpected advocate for human-style training. He established an academy on his homeworld that emphasized mental resilience alongside physical development. His students learned to run without enhancements, to find their limits without technological aids, and to push beyond them through will alone. The next Interstellar Games, held 4 years later, showcased the new format. Dozens of events celebrated the full spectrum of athletic achievement. Humans competed in many, but excelled in only a few. They brought to each competition the same spirit that Aria had demonstrated, joy in the effort itself rather than fixation on the outcome. Aria continued to run, though she never competed in another interstellar event. She returned to Earth and to the trails that had shaped her. Every morning, she would rise before dawn and head out for her daily miles, moving through landscapes that seemed tame after alien worlds, but remained her true home. Young runners would sometimes join her, hoping to learn the secret of her success. She would smile and increase her pace slightly, forcing them to work to keep up. The lesson was in the effort, not in any words she could share. Running revealed its truths only to those willing to pay in sweat and determination. On quiet mornings, when mist rose from the valleys and the only sounds were her footfalls and breathing, Aria would think about that day on Kepler 4-2b, not about the victory or the accolades that followed, but about mile 25, when everything hurt and nothing mattered except the next step. That was where the truth lived, in the space between unbearable and unstoppable. It wasn't a uniquely human space. She had come to understand. Every species had their version of it, their own intersection of physical limit and mental transcendence. Humans had simply maintained their citizenship in that difficult country, while others had sought easier paths. The Interstellar Games continued to evolve, becoming less about competition between civilizations and more about the celebration of diverse forms of excellence. The marathon remained its spiritual center, a test that any being could attempt but few could complete. It stood as a reminder that sometimes the greatest achievements came not from being the strongest or fastest or most advanced, but from simply refusing to stop. Educational programs across the galaxy began incorporating lessons from what philosophers called the human paradox, the achievement of superior results through inferior means. Business schools studied Earth's economic models that succeeded despite lacking advanced prediction algorithms. Military academies analyzed human conflict resolution that emphasized adaptation over overwhelming force. But perhaps the most lasting impact was on the concept of limitation itself. Before Arya's run, most advanced civilizations saw biological limits as problems to be solved through technology. After, there emerged an understanding that limits might serve a purpose, that the struggle against them might be more valuable than their elimination. Years passed. New champions emerged in the reformed interstellar games. Records were set and broken. Technologies advanced and strategies evolved. But in the Museum of Athletic Achievement on the neutral world of Kepler 42b, one display drew more visitors than any other. It wasn't the holographic replay of Arya's historic run, though that was popular. It wasn't the preserved running shoes she had worn, though they had become an almost religious artifact for some. It was a simple plaque bearing the words she had spoken at the closing ceremony. True greatness isn't measured by how fast you run, but by how brightly you smile at the end. The phrase had been translated into every known language, though some required extensive footnotes to explain the concept of smiling through adversity. It had become a rallying cry for athletes across the galaxy, a reminder that joy and effort were inseparable, that the journey mattered more than the destination. Arya herself aged gracefully, her daily runs gradually becoming daily walks, but her spirit remained unchanged. She established a foundation that promoted inclusive athletics across species lines, funding programs that brought together young beings from different worlds to train and learn from each other. On her 60th birthday, she received a message from Zarvix, now an elder statesman in the athletic community. He had finally completed a full marathon, running without any enhancements on his home world. It had taken him 8 hours and left him exhausted for days, but he had finished with what his species' equivalent of a smile. That evening, Arya sat on her porch watching Earth's single sun set over familiar hills. Dr. Song, now her closest friend rather than her coach, sat beside her. They didn't speak of the past or the fame or the ways their actions had changed the galaxy. They simply enjoyed the quiet satisfaction of a life well run. In training centers across known space, new generations of athletes pushed themselves beyond their limits. They ran not because they had to, but because they chose to. Because something in the act of forward motion spoke to a truth that transcended species and culture. They ran seeking that perfect moment when effort became effortless, when pain transformed into purpose, and when they reached their own moments of crisis, when every fiber of their being demanded they stop. They remembered the human who had smiled through 26 miles of impossibility. They remembered that greatness wasn't about being unbreakable, but about choosing to continue when broken. The interstellar games had begun as a showcase of superiority, each civilization striving to prove their advancement over others. They had evolved into something far more valuable, a celebration of the universal spirit that drove all beings to reach beyond their grasp. In the end, Arya's legacy wasn't that humans were better than other species. It was that every species was capable of more than they believed possible. The limits that defined them were also the opportunities that could transform them. The pain that asked them to stop was also the teacher that showed them they could continue. On training grounds throughout the galaxy, coaches of 100 different species shared the same fundamental wisdom with their athletes. Run with joy, compete with honor, and when you reach the point where you cannot take another step, remember the human who proved that point is just the beginning. The universe was vast, filled with wonders beyond counting, but perhaps no wonder was greater than the simple act of choosing to run when walking would suffice, of pushing forward when stopping made more sense, of smiling through suffering because the joy of effort outweighed the comfort of rest. This was the gift humanity brought to the stars, not advanced technology or superior physiology, but the remembered knowledge that extraordinary achievement came from ordinary beings who simply refused to accept ordinary limits. In every gym and track and training facility, in languages that had no word for marathon before humans arrived, athletes whispered the truth that Arya Trost had written with every painful step. We are all capable of more than we know. And so they ran. each seeking their own convergence zone where impossible became inevitable, where limits became launching points, where the distance between unbearable and unstoppable could be crossed with nothing more than the decision to take one more step. The games continued, evolved, and spread. New events emerged and old ones transformed. Records fell and champions rose. But at the heart of it all remained the simple truth that a young woman from Earth had demonstrated on a distant world. That the greatest victory wasn't in being the best, but in discovering just how good you could become. In the vast darkness between stars, aboard ships carrying athletes to competitions, in the quiet moments before the starting signal sounded, the same realization echoed in 1,000 different forms. We are not defined by our limitations, but by our response to them. We are not measured by how we begin, but by how we endure. We are not remembered for being perfect, but for being persistent. And somewhere in that persistence, in the space between one step and the next, between giving up and going on, lived the essence of what it meant to be truly alive in a universe that offered infinite reasons to stop and only one reason to continue, because we could. The binary suns of Kepler 4-2b rose and set with cosmic indifference, marking days that meant nothing to the universe, but everything to those who counted them in miles run and limits transcended. The celestial circuit remained, its adaptive surface ready for the next generation of beings willing to test themselves against more than distance. And in the museum, visitors from across the galaxy continued to gather before that simple plaque, reading words that had redefined what they thought possible. Some left inspired to attempt their own marathons. Others found courage for different challenges entirely. All left understanding that the human who had run through impossible conditions had given them permission to attempt their own impossibilities. The story of the day a human outran the galaxy's best became legend, told in different ways by different species, but always carrying the same essential truth: that somewhere between the starting line and the finish, between confidence and collapse, between unbearable and unstoppable, lived the potential for transcendence. And that potential belonged not to any one species or civilization, but to every being willing to take the first step, and then the next, and then the next after that, until miles became meaning and effort became joy, and the impossible became nothing more than a distance waiting to be covered by those brave enough to begin.